There are people who can casually post dozens of photos every week without a second thought. They document meals, workouts, outfits, casual moments, all shared effortlessly with hundreds or thousands of people. But then there are others for whom posting even a single photo feels like an act of profound vulnerability, almost like standing naked in front of a crowd. Their finger hovers over the share button, and something inside them resists. Anxiety rises, questions flood in. What will people think? What am I revealing? Why does this feel so exposing? And often, they simply can't do it. They delete the draft, retreat into privacy, feeling almost overwhelmed by what seems like such a simple act. So why do some people feel so exposed by posting a single photo when others do it constantly without discomfort? What's happening psychologically that makes this act feel so revealing, so vulnerable, so dangerous? And what can Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who explored the hidden depths of human personality, teach us about why sharing images can feel like exposing your soul? To understand this, we need to start with Jung's concept of psychological boundaries and the structure of the self. Jung understood that psychologically healthy individuals have what we might call permeable but intact boundaries. You need to be able to let certain people in while keeping others out. You need to distinguish between what's private and what's public, what's yours alone and what can be shared. But some people have what Jung might call thin boundaries or highly sensitive boundary systems. For these individuals, the membrane between self and world is more porous, more vulnerable to intrusion. When they share something, even something as seemingly simple as a photo, it feels like they're opening a door directly into their inner world. They're not just sharing an image. They're exposing a piece of their psyche to potential judgment, misunderstanding, or violation. People who feel exposed by posting a single photo often have these thin psychological boundaries. They experience sharing not as a casual social act, but as a genuine opening of the self to the world, with all the vulnerability that entails. This isn't weakness or oversensitivity. It's a particular psychological structure that experiences the boundary between private and public differently than others do. Jung would recognize this as a valid way of being, not something to be overcome, but something to be understood and honored. There's also something crucial happening with what Jung called introversion and the introvert's relationship with the outer world. Remember, Jung defined introversion not as shyness, but as an orientation of psychic energy toward the inner world. For introverts, the subjective interior reality is primary. External reality is experienced through the filter of internal response. When an introvert posts a photo, they're not just putting an image out there, they're externalizing something that naturally belongs to their inner world, and this externalization feels fundamentally uncomfortable, almost unnatural. The photo represents a piece of their subjective experience, a moment they lived internally, and sharing it feels like forcing something private into public view. Moreover, introverts are acutely aware of how they'll be perceived. They can imagine in vivid detail the various ways people might interpret the photo, judge it, react to it. This imaginative capacity, which is a strength in many contexts, becomes a burden when considering sharing. They can feel all the potential responses before they even post, and the weight of all those imagined reactions becomes overwhelming. People who feel exposed by posting a single photo are often deep introverts who experience sharing as a violation of their natural orientation toward privacy and internality. Jung would say they're not being irrational, they're responding authentically to what sharing actually means for someone with their psychological structure. Let's also consider Jung's concept of the persona and what happens when you make it visible. The persona, remember, is the social mask we wear to navigate public life. Everyone constructs some version of a persona. But Jung warned about the dangers of both over-identifying with the persona and making it too rigid or public. When you post a photo on social media, you're essentially constructing or adding to your public persona. You're saying, "This is how I want to be seen. This is the image I'm presenting to the world." For some people, this persona construction happens naturally and comfortably. But for others, particularly those Jung would identify as having a strong connection to their authentic self beneath the persona, creating a public image feels deeply uncomfortable. It feels like creating a false self, or at least a partial self, and then being judged based on that incomplete representation. People who feel exposed by posting often sense this disconnect acutely. They know that any photo they share will be a fragment, a tiny slice of who they are, and they're anxious about being reduced to that fragment in others' minds. They understand intuitively what Jung knew consciously, that the persona is never the whole person, and being seen only as your persona means being fundamentally misunderstood. Their resistance to posting isn't about the photo itself, it's about the reductionism that posting creates. The way a complex, multidimensional human being gets flattened into a static image. There's also something profound happening with what Jung called the shadow and the fear of its exposure. The shadow represents everything about ourselves we don't want to acknowledge, the qualities we're ashamed of, the aspects of our personality we try to hide. For everyone, sharing anything publicly involves anxiety about what might be inadvertently revealed. Will people see my insecurity? Will they notice my flaws? Will they judge the aspects of myself I'm most ashamed of? But for some people, this anxiety is particularly acute because they're more conscious of their shadow, more aware of the discrepancy between how they want to appear and how they fear they actually are. When they consider posting a photo, they don't just see the image itself. They see all the shadow material that might be visible to perceptive observers. They worry that their insecurity will show in their eyes, that their neediness will be apparent in the choice to share, that their vanity or self-doubt or desperation for validation will be transparent to others. This acute awareness of the shadow and its potential visibility makes posting feel genuinely dangerous. It's not just a photo, it's a potential exposure of everything they're trying to hide about themselves. Jung would understand this fear as coming from heightened self-awareness, which is psychologically valuable but also psychologically costly. The more conscious you are of your shadow, the more vulnerable you feel when exposing yourself to others' gaze. Jung also understood something crucial about projection and how it intensifies the feeling of exposure. Jung discovered that people constantly project their own unconscious material onto others. When someone looks at your photo, they're not seeing you objectively. They're seeing their own psychological content reflected back. Their reactions say more about them than about you. But here's the problem. People who feel exposed by posting are often highly aware of this projection dynamic, and it makes sharing even more frightening. They understand that posting a photo means becoming a screen for countless projections. Some people will project their envy, seeing you as privileged or showing off. Others will project their insecurity, comparing themselves unfavorably to you. Still others will project their judgment, criticism, or desires, and you have no control over these projections. You can't determine how people will interpret your image because their interpretation comes from their unconscious, not from your intention. People who feel exposed by posting understand this loss of control acutely. They know that once they share an image, it no longer belongs to them. It becomes material for others' psychological processes, and those processes might be completely unrelated to who they actually are or what they intended to communicate. This understanding creates a genuine vulnerability. You're not just sharing a photo. You're offering yourself as material for others' unconscious projections. And that feels deeply exposing because you know you'll be fundamentally misperceived in ways you can't predict or control. There's also something significant about what Jung called psychic energy and the cost of visibility. Jung believed that all psychological activity requires energy, and that this energy is finite and must be carefully managed. For some people, particularly introverts and highly sensitive individuals, being visible to others is extremely energy-intensive. When they post a photo, they're not just clicking a button, they're opening themselves to energetic exchange with everyone who views it. They'll feel people's attention on them. They'll sense the various reactions, judgments, and projections. They'll carry the awareness of being seen, which requires constant low-level energy expenditure to manage. People who feel exposed by posting often have an intuitive understanding of this energetic cost. They know that sharing a photo will drain them. They'll spend hours or days afterward managing the anxiety of being visible, wondering how people reacted, dealing with the energetic residue of all that attention. For them, the cost-benefit analysis doesn't work out. The energy required to manage visibility exceeds any benefit they might get from sharing. Their resistance to posting isn't irrational. It's intelligent energy management based on accurate understanding of their own energetic capacity and limitations. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the self-conscious personality and its relationship to observation. Jung recognized that some people become acutely self-conscious under observation. The act of being watched changes their experience of themselves. They start seeing themselves through others' eyes, which creates a split in consciousness. You're simultaneously the person having an experience and the person watching yourself have the experience. This split is uncomfortable and disorienting. When someone who's prone to this kind of self-consciousness posts a photo, they're essentially placing themselves under permanent observation. The photo sits there, available to be viewed at any time by any number of people. This creates ongoing self-consciousness. They can't stop imagining people looking at their photo, judging it, forming opinions. The act of posting creates a permanent state of being observed, and for self-conscious individuals, this is psychologically exhausting. People who feel exposed by posting are often those who experience this observation-induced self-consciousness most acutely. They can't casually forget about a photo once it's posted. It continues to occupy their consciousness, creating ongoing anxiety and self-consciousness that makes sharing genuinely costly to their peace of mind. There's also something profound about what Jung called the anima and animus, the inner contrasexual archetypes, and how they relate to self-image. Jung believed that men carry an inner feminine image, the anima, and women carry an inner masculine image, the animus. These inner images affect how we relate to our own appearance and presentation. When you post a photo, you're not just sharing how you look. You're sharing a version of yourself that's been filtered through your relationship with your inner archetypal images. For some people, this relationship is fraught. They're deeply uncertain about their appearance, constantly comparing their actual image to the idealized inner image they carry. When they consider posting a photo, they're acutely aware of the gap between their ideal and their reality, and this gap feels painfully exposing. They imagine others seeing this gap too, judging them for not living up to the idealized image. People who feel exposed by posting often have complicated relationships with their anima or animus. They carry idealized images of how they should look, and actual photos reveal the distance between ideal and reality. This revelation feels shameful and vulnerable, making sharing almost impossible. Jung would understand this as a conflict between the ego's self-image and the archetypal ideal, a conflict that makes visibility genuinely painful. Jung also spoke about what he called the inferior function, the least developed aspect of our psychological type. For people whose inferior function involves extroverted expression or presentation, sharing photos touches their deepest insecurity. They're not naturally good at self-presentation. They don't intuitively understand how to appear, what impression they're making, or how to manage their public image. This lack of natural skill makes posting feel like exposing their inadequacy. It's like someone who's terrible at math being forced to solve problems on a blackboard in front of a crowd. The activity itself touches their area of greatest vulnerability and incompetence. People who feel exposed by posting often have inferior functions related to external presentation. They're gifted in other areas, perhaps deep thinking, emotional sensitivity, or creative imagination, but self-presentation isn't their strength. When they post, they're operating from their weakest function, which naturally creates anxiety and a sense of exposure. Jung would say this isn't something to overcome by forcing yourself to post more. It's something to honor by accepting your natural strengths and limitations. There's also something crucial about what Jung called the collective and its power to judge and exclude. Jung understood that human beings have a deep, instinctual fear of being rejected by the collective, cast out from the group. This fear has evolutionary roots. For most of human history, being excluded from your social group meant death. When someone posts a photo, they're essentially submitting themselves to the collective for judgment. Will I be accepted? Will I be mocked? Will I be found worthy or wanting? For some people, this submission to collective judgment triggers deep, primal anxiety. They're not just worried about a few negative comments. They're experiencing the ancient fear of being judged unacceptable by the tribe and cast out. People who feel exposed by posting often have a heightened sensitivity to this collective power. They feel the weight of potential collective judgment more acutely than others. This isn't paranoia. It's an accurate perception of a real dynamic. Social media does create collective judgment, and that judgment can be harsh and excluding. Their reluctance to post is a healthy protective response to a genuine threat. Jung would recognize this as wisdom, understanding the power of the collective and choosing not to subject yourself to its potentially destructive judgment. Let's also consider what Jung understood about vulnerability and the difference between chosen and forced exposure. Jung recognized that humans need to control the pace and degree of their vulnerability. Genuine intimacy involves choosing to be vulnerable with specific people who've earned that trust. But social media creates a different dynamic. When you post a photo, you're being vulnerable to everyone simultaneously, known and unknown, trusted and untrusted. This indiscriminate vulnerability feels wrong to many people because it violates the natural rhythm of gradually revealing yourself as trust is built. People who feel exposed by posting often have a healthy sense of how vulnerability should work. They understand that not everyone has earned the right to see certain aspects of them. Posting feels exposing because it's forced vulnerability, shared with the masses rather than carefully given to trusted individuals. This resistance isn't closeness or fear, it's appropriate discrimination about who deserves access to your inner world. Jung would see this as psychological health, maintaining appropriate boundaries about who gets to see what parts of you. There's also something profound about what Jung called the autonomous complexes and how they affect our relationship with visibility. Jung discovered that the psyche contains semi-independent clusters of psychological material, complexes that have their own energy and can essentially take over consciousness temporarily. Many people have complexes around appearance, worthiness, or being judged. When someone with strong complexes around these themes considers posting a photo, the complex gets activated. Suddenly they're flooded with all the emotional charge connected to that complex. Anxiety, shame, inadequacy, fear of rejection. The photo isn't just a photo anymore. It's a trigger for deeply painful psychological material. People who feel exposed by posting often have strong complexes that get activated by the prospect of visibility. The intensity of their reaction, the way posting a simple photo can feel overwhelming, indicates that they're not just dealing with the photo itself, but with an entire complex of painful associations and memories. Jung would approach this with compassion, understanding that the reaction is coming from deep psychological wounds that deserve respect and careful healing, not from irrational fear that should be overcome through forced exposure. Jung also understood something about the relationship between consciousness and self-image. The more conscious you are, the more aware you become of the gap between how you see yourself and how you actually appear to others. Some people have achieved significant self-awareness, and this awareness makes posting photos particularly difficult. They're painfully conscious of their flaws, their insecurities, their imperfections. When they look at a photo of themselves, they see all of this with brutal clarity. And they can't imagine sharing that with others, can't bear the thought of others seeing what they see when they look at themselves. People who feel exposed by posting often have this heightened consciousness about their own image. Their awareness, which is psychologically valuable in many ways, becomes a burden when considering visibility. They can't unsee their own imperfections, and they assume others will see them just as clearly. This creates genuine vulnerability. They're not being vain or superficial. They're dealing with the psychological cost of consciousness, seeing themselves clearly and feeling exposed by that clarity. There's also something significant about what Jung called the pure eternus, or puella eterna, the eternal youth archetype, and its relationship to fear of being seen. This archetype represents the part of us that wants to remain potential rather than actual, possibility rather than reality. When you post a photo, you're making yourself actual, real, concrete. You're no longer pure potential. You're this specific person who looks this specific way. For people caught in the pure or puella dynamic, this concretization feels like a death of possibility. As long as they don't post, they can imagine themselves as potentially more attractive, more interesting, more impressive than any actual photo would show. The photo fixes them in reality, ending the dream of infinite potential. People who feel exposed by posting may be struggling with this archetypal pattern. They're not ready to become actual, to be seen as they really are, rather than as they might be. This resistance isn't just insecurity, it's an archetypal reluctance to move from potential to actual, from dream to reality, from possibility to limitation. Jung would understand this as a developmental issue that requires gentle work on accepting your actual human limitations rather than clinging to unlimited potential. Let's also consider what Jung understood about empathic sensitivity and its relationship to visibility. Jung recognized that some people are what we might call psychically sensitive, unusually attuned to others' emotional states and psychological energies. When an empathically sensitive person posts a photo, they don't just share an image. They feel all the various energies directed toward them as people view and react. They sense judgment, envy, criticism, desire, all the complex emotional responses that their image triggers in others. This sensitivity makes posting genuinely overwhelming. They're not imagining these responses, they're actually feeling them, picking up on subtle energies that less sensitive people don't register. People who feel exposed by posting are often highly empathic or psychically sensitive. Their resistance to visibility is protective, limiting their exposure to emotional and energetic input that they'll inevitably feel and have to process. This isn't weakness. It's appropriate self-protection for someone with heightened sensitivity. Jung would recognize this sensitivity as a gift that requires special care and boundaries to prevent overwhelming. There's also something profound about what Jung called the self, the deep center of wholeness, and its relationship to image. Jung believed that the self is ultimately mysterious and can't be adequately represented in any image or concept. It exceeds all attempts to capture it. When someone deeply connected to their self considers posting a photo, they may feel a kind of existential resistance. They know intuitively that no image can represent who they truly are, and sharing a photo feels like a lie, a reduction of their vast inner complexity to a flat, frozen image. People who feel exposed by posting may be feeling this existential inadequacy of images. They're not comfortable with being reduced to appearance, with being seen only as a visual object rather than as the complex, mysterious being they actually are. Their resistance reveals a deep understanding that images lie, that they claim to show who you are while actually showing only the most superficial surface. Jung would appreciate this resistance as philosophical wisdom, understanding the profound limitation of images to capture human essence. Jung also spoke about what he called psychological defenses and their legitimate function. Defense mechanisms aren't always pathological. Sometimes they protect genuinely vulnerable aspects of the psyche that aren't ready for exposure. When someone feels exposed by posting, their psyche may be defending something that legitimately needs protection. Perhaps they're going through a period of transition where their identity is unstable. Perhaps they're healing from trauma that makes visibility feel dangerous. Perhaps they're in a vulnerable life stage where external judgment would be particularly damaging. People who feel exposed by posting may have defenses that are appropriately protecting vulnerable psychological material. Jung would never suggest forcing through these defenses. He understood that defenses serve important functions and should be respected until the psyche is ready to lower them voluntarily. The feeling of exposure is a signal from the psyche that says, "Not yet, not ready, needs more protection." Honoring this signal is psychological wisdom, not cowardice. There's also something crucial about what Jung called individuation and its relationship to conformity. Individuation requires differentiating yourself from collective norms, discovering your own unique path rather than following the crowd. In a culture where posting photos is normalized, expected, almost mandatory, refusing to post becomes an act of individuation. You're saying through your refusal that you won't conform to collective expectations, that you'll honor your own needs and boundaries even when they differ from the norm. People who feel exposed by posting and choose not to do so are often engaged in this individuation process, whether they realize it or not. They're listening to their own inner voice, rather than the collective voice that says, everyone should be visible, everyone should share, everyone should participate. This refusal, this honoring of their authentic discomfort, is actually psychological maturity according to Jung's framework. They're individuating by staying true to themselves, rather than forcing themselves into behaviors that don't fit their nature. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the numinous experiences of the sacred and their relationship to privacy. Jung believed that certain experiences touch something beyond the ego, something sacred or transcendent. These numinous experiences require protection. When exposed to profane scrutiny, they lose their power and meaning. For some people, images of themselves carry numinous significance. A photo isn't just documentation. It captures a sacred moment, a particular expression of their being that feels too precious to be casually shared. Posting such an image feels like profanation, like taking something sacred and throwing it to the masses to be consumed and forgotten. People who feel exposed by posting may be protecting the numinous quality of their own image. They sense that their physical form, their appearance, their captured moments have sacred significance that should be protected from casual viewing. This isn't vanity, it's reverence, treating your own being as something sacred that deserves protection from profanation. Jung would deeply respect this attitude, recognizing it as spiritual maturity. There's also something significant about what Jung called typological differences and how they affect relationships with visibility. Jung's psychological types include differences in how people relate to the objective world. Some types naturally externalize, finding it easy and natural to put themselves out there. Other types naturally internalize, finding externalization uncomfortable and unnatural. When an internalizing type tries to post a photo, they're working against their natural typological orientation. It's not that they can't do it. It's that doing it requires significant effort and feels fundamentally wrong, like writing with your non-dominant hand. People who feel exposed by posting are often internalizing types trying to behave like externalizing types. The discomfort they feel isn't a problem to be solved. It's information about their type, telling them that this behavior doesn't fit their natural orientation. Jung would encourage respecting typological differences rather than trying to force everyone into extroverted, externalizing behaviors just because the culture values those. Jung also understood something about what he called the reality of psychological pain and its validity. For some people, posting a photo causes genuine psychological distress, anxiety that can last days, shame spirals, obsessive thoughts about how they're being perceived. This pain is real, not imagined or exaggerated. It's a signal that something about the activity is psychologically dangerous for this particular person. When someone says posting feels exposing, they're not being dramatic. They're accurately reporting their psychological experience. People who feel exposed by posting are experiencing real psychological distress, and that distress deserves to be taken seriously. Jung would never dismiss someone's psychological pain as irrational or something to just push through. He understood that psychological reality is as real as physical reality, and that pain in either realm deserves respect and appropriate response. If posting causes genuine distress, the appropriate response is to not post, to honor the psyche's signal that this activity is harmful for you. There's also something profound about what Jung called the relationship between consciousness and suffering. Jung believed that increased consciousness often brings increased suffering because you become aware of things that unconscious people don't see. People who feel exposed by posting are often highly conscious. They see all the implications of sharing that others miss. They understand the complex dynamics of visibility, projection, judgment, and vulnerability. And this understanding makes posting painful in ways that less conscious people don't experience. Their suffering isn't pathology. It's the cost of consciousness, seeing clearly what's actually happening when you make yourself visible. Jung would honor this consciousness even while acknowledging its cost, recognizing that awareness always comes with the burden of seeing what others remain blind to. Finally, there's something to be said about what Jung called the wisdom of symptoms. In Jungian psychology, symptoms aren't just problems to be eliminated. They're messages from the psyche, attempting to communicate something important. When someone feels exposed by posting, the feeling itself is a symptom with a message. Perhaps the message is, you need stronger boundaries. Perhaps it's, you're not ready for this level of visibility. Perhaps it's, this behavior doesn't align with your authentic self. Perhaps it's, you're protecting something that needs protection. People who feel exposed by posting are receiving important messages from their psyche, and Jung would encourage listening to these messages rather than overriding them. The feeling of exposure is wisdom, your psyche telling you something important about what you need. Honoring that feeling, respecting that wisdom, and choosing not to post when it feels exposing isn't weakness or limitation. It's psychological intelligence, listening to your own depths and responding with appropriate care. In the end, people who feel exposed by posting a single photo aren't being irrational, oversensitive, or problematic. They're experiencing posting as what it actually is for them, a genuine act of psychological vulnerability that carries real costs and risks. Carl Jung would recognize these individuals as often highly conscious, sensitive, boundaried people who understand something about visibility, vulnerability, and the psyche that casual posters have missed. Their discomfort isn't a problem to be fixed. It's information to be honored, a signal from the psyche that deserves respect. In a culture that pressures everyone toward visibility, these individuals are practicing profound wisdom by listening to their own psychological truth rather than conforming to collective expectations. Their feeling of exposure reveals not weakness, but depth, not pathology, but consciousness, not limitation, but appropriate self-protection. And Jung would say that honoring this feeling, respecting your own psychological boundaries, and choosing privacy over forced visibility is one of the most psychologically mature choices you can make.